This is a story of D-Day you've likely never heard. It is not a story of frontline combat, but of the war behind the lines, a war of mathematics, engineering, and staggering organization. It is the story of how the Allies solved the greatest logistical problem in the history of warfare, how to supply an invasion army in France, without a single port to its name. This is the story of the unseen victory. The plan for Operation Overlord was audacious. The initial assault aimed to land over 130,000 troops and 17,000 vehicles onto a 50-mile stretch of fortified French coastline. But this was just the beginning. The real challenge was not landing them, but sustaining them. Imagine the daily needs of a small city: food, fuel, ammunition, medical supplies, and replacement parts. Now, imagine that city is on the move, fighting a war, and you have to supply it from across a treacherous body of water. The numbers were astronomical. By the fourth day after D-Day, known as D+4, the invasion force would require 6,000 tons of supplies every single day. By D+8, this would climb to 9,000 tons. And by D+16, the requirement was a staggering 12,000 tons per day. To put that in perspective, a single ton is 2,000 pounds. 12,000 tons is the weight of thousands of trucks, or millions of rounds of ammunition. Traditional military doctrine was clear: to supply an army on this scale, you needed a deep-water port. Ports have cranes, railways, warehouses, and berthing spaces for large cargo ships. The Allies knew the Germans understood this too. The closest major port, Cherbourg, was a fortress, and intelligence indicated that the enemy was prepared to demolish it completely if it fell. Relying on capturing a functional port was a recipe for disaster. The Allies had to invent a new way of war. They had to create a system that could function entirely over open beaches, in all weather, under constant threat. The entire invasion hinged on solving this impossible equation. Before a single soldier could set foot in Normandy, the United Kingdom had to be transformed into one massive armed camp and supply depot. This monumental effort was codenamed Operation Bolero. For 2 years, a relentless stream of men and material crossed the U-boat-infested Atlantic from the United States. By the spring of 1944, over 1.5 million American soldiers were stationed in Britain. But these men arrived with little more than their personal gear. Their tanks, trucks, artillery, and ammunition had to be shipped separately in a meticulously orchestrated logistical ballet. The Services of Supply, or SOS, commanded by Major General John C. H. Lee, was the engine of this effort. They constructed enormous storage complexes across the British countryside. The statistics are hard to comprehend: 6.5 million square feet of covered storage, and nearly 38 million square feet of open storage, fields packed with crated tanks, stacked artillery shells, and rows upon rows of trucks, all waiting for the signal to move. To manage this flood, the Allies developed a revolutionary pre-shipment system. Instead of units arriving with all their equipment, their gear was shipped in advance. When a unit landed in Britain, it would draw its vehicles and weapons from these vast depots. This system maximized shipping space and gave troops more time to train with their actual equipment. The United Kingdom was divided into sections, each with a specific role. The Western Base Section handled the bulk of incoming troops from America. The Southern Base Section became the final marshalling area, where soldiers were loaded onto landing craft. This entire nation-sized machine was designed for one purpose: to launch a single, decisive blow. The spring was coiled, tighter and tighter, awaiting its release. To cross the English Channel and conquer the shoreline, the Allies couldn't rely on traditional navies. They needed a new kind of fleet, a fleet of specialized, unglamorous, but utterly essential vessels designed for the singular task of bridging sea and land. The backbone of this fleet was the landing ship, tank, or LST. At 300 feet long and displacing 4,000 tons, it was a behemoth. Its genius was in its simplicity: it could sail directly onto a beach, open massive clamshell doors in its bow, and lower a ramp, allowing tanks, trucks, and troops to drive directly onto the sand. Despite their crucial role, they were slow and vulnerable. Their crews sarcastically called them large slow targets. But without them, the invasion would have been impossible. Supporting the LSTs were the smaller, more agile landing craft, tank, or LCT. These were the workhorses of the initial assault waves, each capable of carrying a handful of tanks or hundreds of tons of cargo right into the heart of the battle. They were open-decked, exposed to the elements and enemy fire, but they delivered the vital heavy firepower needed to secure the beachheads. Perhaps the most ingenious invention of all was the DUKW. Pronounced duck, it was a miracle of adaptation. It was a standard 2.5-ton truck, encased in a watertight hull. It could swim ashore from a ship offshore at a speed of 5 knots, carrying 5,000 pounds of cargo. Once its wheels touched ground, it could drive inland at 45 miles per hour. The DUKW was the ultimate connector, seamlessly moving supplies from ship to depot without ever needing a port. It was the linchpin of the over-the-shore logistics concept. This fleet of misfits, the slow LSTs, the rugged LCTs, and the versatile ducks, formed the circulatory system of the entire invasion. Even with this specialized fleet, the Allies faced a critical bottleneck. The large, deep-draft Liberty ships and Victory ships, which carried the bulk of the supplies from America, could not get close to the shore. They needed a port. Since they couldn't capture one in time, the Allies made an astonishing decision: they would build their own and tow them across the English Channel. This was the birth of the Mulberry Harbours, one of the greatest engineering secrets of the war. The Mulberry was not a single structure, but a complex puzzle of interconnected components. First, there were the breakwaters. To create calm water, the Allies constructed Phoenix caissons, enormous hollow concrete boxes, as large as a 5-story building. Dozens of these were built, floated into position, and then sunk to form a protective arc. To supplement them, a fleet of obsolete merchant and warships, codenamed Gooseberries, were sailed to Normandy and scuttled in a line, forming additional breakwaters. Inside this protected artificial lagoon, the real magic happened. Floating roadways, codenamed Whale, were constructed. These were flexible bridges made of steel and concrete that rested on pontoon supports. They bobbed with the waves, connecting the shore to the final piece, the Löbnitz piers. These were massive pier heads that were fixed to the seabed but had landing stages that could rise and fall with the 30-foot tides of Normandy. This allowed deep-draft ships to tie up and unload their cargo directly onto trucks, 24 hours a day. 2 complete Mulberry Harbours were built. Mulberry was constructed off Omaha Beach for the Americans. Mulberry B was built at Arromanches for the British. The effort was Herculean. It involved hundreds of companies across Britain and consumed vast quantities of steel and concrete. When they became operational, the results were dramatic. Unloading times for LSTs dropped from a grueling 12 hours to less than 2. For a few critical days, it seemed the logistical problem had been solved by a stroke of engineering genius. But nature was about to intervene in a way no one had predicted. On June 19, just days after the landings, the weather over the English Channel began to deteriorate. What started as a strong wind soon escalated into the worst storm to hit the Normandy coast in 40 years. For 3 days, gale-force winds whipped the sea into a fury, and massive waves pounded the shoreline. The Mulberry Harbours, engineering marvels though they were not designed for this. The American Mulberry, at Omaha Beach took the full brunt of the storm. The Phoenix caissons were pounded and shifted. The floating Whale roadways were torn apart. The Löbnitz piers were twisted into wreckage. Within days, the harbor was a total loss. The British Mulberry B at Arromanches, sheltered in a slight cove, was severely damaged but survived. The storm was a catastrophe for the supply lines. Landing throughput was slashed by 60%. The Allies were already behind schedule, and now the lifeline was severed. With their artificial harbor destroyed and Cherbourg still not captured, the entire invasion teetered on the brink of logistical collapse. The situation was desperate. In response, the Americans made a fateful decision. They would abandon the high-tech solution and return to basics. They would make the beaches themselves the port. A massive cleanup operation was launched. 1,500 soldiers were dispatched to clear Omaha Beach of wrecked landing craft and shattered equipment. Every available LST, LCT, and DUKW was pressed into service, working around the clock in a frenetic, chaotic, but determined ballet of pure manpower. And then, something remarkable happened. The over-the-shore system, refined and pushed to its absolute limit, began to perform miracles. To the astonishment of planners, Omaha Beach, just days after the storm, began processing 13,500 tons of supplies per day, 115% of its planned capacity. Utah Beach was handling 7,000 tons per day, 124% of its target. Through sheer grit, improvisation, and the relentless effort of thousands of unsung laborers, the pipeline was not just restored, it was supercharged. By June 30, over 450,000 troops had landed. It was not the planned 579,000, but it was enough. It was enough men, enough supplies, and enough momentum to secure the beachhead and begin the liberation of Europe. The success of the D-Day landings is a tribute to the courage of the infantryman, the skill of the airman, and the bravery of the sailor. But underpinning all of it was an achievement of logistics. As the ancient Greek general Pericles once said, the sinews of war are infinite money. In the modern era, the sinews of war are fuel, bullets, and food, delivered relentlessly and without fail. The story of D-Day logistics is a story of adaptation. When the pre-built harbors failed, the system adapted and triumphed with raw determination. It was a victory achieved not by a few brilliant generals, but by an army of logisticians, engineers, stevedores, and truck drivers. In fact, for every frontline combat soldier in Normandy, there were multiple support personnel ensuring he could fight another day. The lessons learned on those beaches, about supply chain management, improvisation, and large-scale mobilization, echo to this day. They inform modern military doctrine and even global humanitarian relief efforts. So, when we remember the heroism of D-Day, let us also remember the unseen victory. Let us remember the planners who solved the impossible equation, the engineers who built a floating miracle, and the countless men who, under fire and in howling storms, proved that an army truly does march on its stomach. They were the foundation upon which victory was built.